Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. This week we are covering the violence perpetrated against the asylum seekers at the border, the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm sure you've heard much about this story. You know, there's no way that anyone in the country has not heard about this story so far. So what we're going to do is specifically talk to someone who has been working with a caravan coming from Honduras, who has been reporting on the ground from there about not only the nature of the caravan itself, but also the clashes at the border. So we're trying to get a unique perspective on that here on the show. So to do that, we are joined by Adan Plascencia. Adan is a student of sociology, a journalist, as well as an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Thank you, Adan, for coming on.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate it, Brian, for having me on today.
We're very glad to have you on. Can you tell me a little bit about your own kind of experiences leading up to the leading up to the violence where the U.S. shot tear gas at these asylum seekers across the border? Can you talk about first of all, what is this caravan, and what sort of were your experiences with this?
Yeah, absolutely. Me and a team from Liberation News, we went down to the city of Mexico between the days of November 1st and November 9th, and we were able to be with the caravan for 9 days, and we traveled with them about 400, almost 500 miles through one of the most dangerous parts of Mexico. They call it La Fosa de Mexico, which means mass grave, littered with hundreds of these clandestine mass graves all over the states of Veracruz, Puebla, Tamaulipas. Anyways, the Liberation News team was able to go and we had seen in the mainstream media and the Trump rhetoric that supposedly all the people that were coming from Central America were these so-called invaders, these so-called hordes of people, and that there were Middle Easterners in the groups, and referring to the fact that there may be some terrorists and some criminals coming. And we said, wow, the caravan is being used as almost like a punching bag for the Republican Party in the lead up to the midterms. And so we said we need to get down there, and we went, and we were quite shocked by what and who is coming in the caravan. And as a grand majority, the first caravan, because there has been a kind of second caravan that came afterwards, we were with the first one. In its majority, Honduran people. We met a few Salvadoreños and Guatemaltecos. But in its majority, it was Honduran people, tons of families, young boys, young men, older men, about 80 pregnant women, about 80 people in the LGBTQ community. But I would say in its grand majority, it was families fleeing organized crime, fleeing repression from the state. And so I think those are a few characteristics of the group.
Yeah, I think that's of course so very important for people to hear, for those people who may not have gotten kind of the full story. I'd also like to talk about kind of what I believe to be the missing piece within the reporting on the Honduras caravan. That is to say, what exactly it was they were fleeing. So there was obviously the kind of narrative going around that they were fleeing some sort of decontextualized violence. It was always kind of violence in Central America, without a clear sense of why there would be this violence or why there would be such kind of disruption of normal ways of life within, primarily Honduras, but also other countries in Central America. So, some of you listening, some people listening may know that, Honduras was overthrown, or rather the government of Honduras was overthrown in a 2009 coup by the Obama administration, largely supported by the Obama administration, including Hillary Clinton. I'm wondering how much of that you were able to draw from the narrative of understanding that this is, this is not just decontextualized violence. This is not, chaos for its own sake, but in fact is a very kind of political chaos at which the U.S. Is really the root of so much of this. So how much of that did you kind of notice along the during your time with the caravan, and can you maybe speak a little bit more to that coup as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, to tell you the truth, the context of which to understand this caravan is it actually goes a little bit farther than the coup. In the 1980s, Honduras was used as a military and geostrategic base to fight and send the Contras to Nicaragua from, and to other revolutionary battles that were happening in Central America, including El Salvador and Guatemala. And we obviously know the absolute, almost honestly genocidal wars that were being fought in Central America a few administrations back. But let's now speed up to this 2009. In June of 2009, a liberal president by the name of Mel Zelaya was under popular pressure. In Latin America, a lot of these leftist new governments were starting to recreate a new constitution. They were starting to have constituent assemblies and create new constitutions that guaranteed the right of housing, the rights of education, the right of a job, of a minimum wage, etc. They were expanding the rights that people had. And so in Honduras, they attempted the same thing. And in June of 2009, the same day that they were supposed to vote, the people of Honduras were going to vote whether they wanted to convoke a constituent assembly or no. That same day, there is a military coup where they send the military into Mel Zelaya's home. They take him out of his home and they fly him out of the country. And later that day, they put in the president of the Congress, Micheletti, and that coup was then later recognized almost immediately by the U.S. administration, by the ambassador in Honduras, and it's this coup of 2009 that unleashes once again this very repressive state that had kind of been, toned down a little bit between the years of the early 90s and the first decade of the 21st century, but this coup unleashes once again the repression of the people that were manifesting, because they wanted their president Mel Zelaya. He was a very popular president, not a leftist. People would try to compare him to Fidel Castro, but no, not at all. Not a socialist, a liberal guy, came from business, but he was a very popular person. And so there's this coup in 2009. But I think in bigger part is that on top of the coup is that there is also just the complete, even more privatization of land. And so last year, in November of 2017, there were supposed to be new elections. There was this guy, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who had already become president for a few years. And there is this new elections because there's the cycle. And somehow what happens is that somehow he's losing in the race in the morning, and then all of a sudden he's winning towards the end of the day, and he wins once again. And the people come out, they protest, they say, we wanted a different president. Why can't we have them? Why are you doing this to us, Juan Orlando Hernandez? We need you out of here. And as they say, Juan Orlando Hernandez had created this new national police, putting them kind of like a military police, and some of their commanders and generals were trained by the United States Army. And so there's this huge repression that comes with all these demonstrations all over the country, beginning last year in November 26th of 2017. And it is in that context that the caravan has been born out of. If I can say one more thing, this journalist by the name of Bartolo Fuentes, he gave a press conference in the city of Mexico where he said the same foreign ministry on its website says that 200 to 300 people flee Honduras every single day. They admit that. The foreign ministry of Honduras admits that. He just said, this is simply the accumulation of 20 days. Somehow, everyone decided to just leave at the same time. But people have been fleeing Honduras every single day because there is violence from organized crime, but there is also violence from the state forces, from the police. There is impunity. And so I think that's some of the context that the caravan has came out of.
Yeah, it's certainly an incredible and unfortunate series of events, so much of which is sponsored, by this kind of bipartisan U.S. consensus. And when I point out that Hillary Clinton specifically Hillary Clinton under the Obama administration, but the Obama administration, largely speaking, were kind of the backers of this coup in many ways. That's not to say that the Republican Party is necessarily, any less anti-war, any less whatnot. I obviously feel the need to point it out because it seems that Clinton is possibly going to pursue a run in 2020. And if you thought she was right wing then, she's going to be coming out as, every kind of statement she's made up until this point, including the fact, including the assertion that we need to supposedly get our borders under control or whatnot. Essentially, that in order to stop the far right, we need to capitulate to their demands. Shows that she's going to run on an even more right wing campaign this time around, where she's essentially going to call for increased border security to essentially keep out these asylum seekers who are the evidence of her own disastrous foreign policy, disastrous for Central America, but very profitable for United States corporations. That's going to be the platform on which, if she does run, she will be running in 2020. Which will, of course, just hand the election to Trump by all accounts. But I'd like to, bringing that up, I'd like to keep it focused more on the caravan itself and more on the kind of responses and what sort of, conclusions and what sort of analyses can we apply to the situation with the caravan. So a lot of people have pointed out, a lot of more left-wing journalists have pointed out the similarities in the rhetoric and the kind of tactics around the suppression of the caravan at the border in the U.S. and similar tactics that have been employed and similar kind of weaponry and ideology that have been employed with Israel. Essentially militarizing their own border to keep Gaza, which is the world's largest open air prison, completely isolated. So basically, long story short, we see a similar kind of militarization in both the U.S. and Israel. So I'm wondering, with the deployment of tear gas, what did that kind of look like on the ground? Because I understand, you did a lot of reporting, and you were organizing kind of near the border at that point. And what kind of have you seen coming out of the way the U.S. has militarized its border in response to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, this rhetoric that has been coming from the Trump administration and including the DHS secretary that they're going to treat stones as if they were weapons, and if they throw any stones over the border, that the U.S. Military has authorization to use lethal weapons. That is a complete. I think it was an amazing, crazy speech, similar, as you were saying, and parallel to what you hear in the administration and in Israel against the Palestinian people. And just to go into the events that happened that Sunday, this past Sunday, was that a peaceful group was marching towards the port of entry, hoping to be able to seek the asylum process and application that they are completely entitled to. The U.S. is completely obligated by international law to process any asylum process or any asylum applicant that attempts to apply for asylum, any refugee. However, as we all know and saw in those images, they were met and welcomed with tear gas and including pepper spray. And this same tear gas and pepper spray is used in Gaza, is also used by the Honduran military and the Honduran police. And so they were not, of course, after traveling almost 2,500 miles, they were like, the United States cannot also use tear gas at its own border near its own people, and come to see, they absolutely did. They absolutely did. And we obviously saw the images of the woman running away from the tear gas deployment. There was children in the group as they were fleeing the tear gas. And yeah, I was down there in San Diego with about almost 500 people on this side of the border on the U.S., and we had a demonstration near the pedestrian port of entry, the San Isidro, and the caravan, and those who were attacked by the United States, they were maybe, I would say maybe less than 2 miles away, or maybe like a mile away. But the mood of what the border is like right now, which is quite unusual, is that there is these helicopters flying all along the border, back and forth. Even some points they would fly really kind of low, and almost it felt like they were intimidating people. And so it was quite a scene. You see these Marines and Border Patrol posted up all along the border, riding around their little Humvees, speeding back and forth all across the border. They're all geared up as if they're about to go to war. And who are you going to war with? Poor people. That's who they're keeping out, is more poor people that have, that are attempting to change their lives because they have no opportunities, and yet they're welcomed with tear gas. And so, no, absolutely, I would say that there's a lot of similarities in the treatment of these refugees that have arrived to the U.S. border as those who have participated in those ongoing marches of return to Palestine. Absolutely, Brian.
Yeah, so if you're just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We are talking with Adan Plascencia, who's a student of sociology, a journalist, as well as an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, about his experiences with the Honduras caravan, who he was covering for Liberation News, as well as his experiences organizing along the border to protest the U.S. Militarization of the border. So you can find his work at liberationnews.org, where so much of the Honduras caravan has been covered from kind of a real emancipatory, liberatory perspective that I think is absolutely necessary and is missing and always will be missing from the kind of corporate mainstream. So I would like to also talk about just generally. We made the comparison between the borders of Israel and the kind of way Israel has militarized its border, which then becomes a test case. That's essentially where so much of the kind of weaponry coming out of companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and other of the so-called defense contractors, as the war contractors, the people the corporations whose entire profit comes from the kind of perpetuation of war. So many of these weapons get beta tested on the Israeli border against Palestinian civilians, against unarmed, starving Palestinians. We saw, of course, when Trump made the comment of comparing the rock to a rifle, there's no way that can be seen as anything other than a reference to the proud tradition of throwing stones by Palestinians at the Israeli military. That kind of tradition of resistance when so much has been reduced, so much of your own society has been reduced to rubble by Israeli occupation. So that kind of that symbolism of throwing this rock at the border, which from my understanding wasn't a thing that really happened, but is used as the very, very flimsy pretext to unleash this kind of mass devastation against Palestinians. Again, so much of that gets, so much of these weapons, so much of these kind of new weapons of war coming out of Lockheed Martin and whatnot, coming out of the defense contractors, the so-called defense contractors, get beta tested first in Israel and then find their way, of course, onto the militarized borders of places like the U.S. And one of the things I want to touch on is also the role of the possible role of climate change here in the militarization of the borders, because I think, now that even a majority, I heard a study the other day where even a majority of Republicans now believe in climate change, now understand this to exist. There's no official denial. So then I think in a way the kind of actions around so much of the U.S. ruling class have pivoted toward the militarization of the borders of the global north to prevent the kind of what they believe to be an impending mass movement from the areas of the global south most affected by climate change. I wonder if you've kind of seen or heard anything that would kind of confirm that suspicion from either your own experiences or from things you've read and studied about this militarization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the U.S. border here dividing the United States and Mexico has been militarized since 1994. Since 1994, under Bill Clinton, and then later under George Bush's son, they kept sending more and more money to the border. Let's get 5,000 more border patrol. Let's build up the wall higher or more deeper. Let's bring surveillance. Let's bring drones. Let's put all these cameras in the field. And so there has definitely been an uptick in a bigger context. We're talking about almost a 20-year period. And so, of course, the ruling class, as we know, Chevron had known that climate change was happening back in I think it was like the 70s or the 80s.
So we're going to go ahead and have to wrap it up for now. We've been talking with Adan Plascencia. who's a student of sociology, a journalist, as well as an organizer for the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Thank you, Adan, for coming on the show. And if there's anything else you'd like to add, feel free to go ahead and add that now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Brian, for letting me have a space to speak on today. I think just one point that I'd like to drive home is that the caravan is not a caravan of migrants. It is not a caravan of criminals. It is a caravan of refugees, and they have made their own statements. And I would like people, if they want to really hear some on the ground great journalism from Honduras all the way to the U.S. border, to follow El Perro Amarillo, which means the yellow dog in Spanish. You can look them up on Facebook. A good resource to learn about the coup in 2009 is a YouTube movie called ¿Quién dijo miedo? Who said afraid? It is a movie about the 2009 coup, and you can understand the role of the United States in it. And yeah, I think we need to just, take this information of who is really in the caravan back to our communities, have forums, have direct actions, organize solidarity drives, and we need to really do something for this group of people who have left everything behind. I remember this one quote. This priest had said, "What is it that people are fleeing, that they have risked their lives to this degree?" And I think that was such a great question. They are fleeing one of the most repressive states, one of the most poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, arguably in the world. And they went on a 2,500-mile journey to the U.S. border with only what they had on their back, with strollers, with one pair of shoes, if they had shoes at all. And I really like people to find out the real information. Don't just get caught up in all the mainstream media lies of that even people in Mexico don't want them, or the Mexican people have shown their solidarity. They have shown their solidarity, and the caravan arrived to Tijuana with food, with shelter along the route, with the help and the solidarity of the Mexican people. And we also in the United States need to do our own part and force and push our own government to process and expedite those applications of political asylum.
So you've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates out of 91.7 KOOP in Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, iTunes, SoundCloud, and wherever podcasts are potted. So thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more People's Republic in just a moment. This week, we are discussing the indictment of Amber Guyger. That is the Dallas officer who some months ago, I believe, shot and killed Botham Jean in Dallas in his own home. So we want to bring some updates to that story, as well as what's going on the ground in Dallas in terms of organizing against police brutality, as well as kind of bringing justice to this officer who, as mentioned, killed Botham Jean in his own apartment earlier this year. So joining us to talk about this and more is John Fullinwider, one of the co-founders of Mothers Against Police Brutality, as well as a longtime community organizer. Thank you, John, for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot, Brian.
Can you give us a little bit of a context for both the indictment and generally what the Guyger case is for those who may have forgotten about it? Okay.
First, people might be interested in a little bit about Mothers Against Police Brutality. The organization was founded in 2013 by a woman named Colette Flanagan. Her son Clinton Allen had been shot to death by a Dallas police officer in March of that year. He was an unarmed 25-year-old African-American man, and he was shot 7 times, 5 times in the chest, once in his upper arm as if it were raised, and once at close range in the back. And she asked another organizer here in Dallas, Sarah Mokuria, and myself if we would help her start an organization to focus on police brutality in Dallas. Sarah had lost her father when she was 10 years old in 1992. 2 officers shot him to death while he was standing beside her. She was 10 at the time. And so most of the people involved in the organization are women and families who've lost a loved one to police violence. My own background is I've been for about 4 decades now, I've been a street-level community organizer in Dallas. And the first police case I worked on was in the 1970s, and the Botham Jean case was the most recent one that I've worked on. With the Botham Jean case, he was killed on the night of September 6th, 2018. And with that case, it's a standard pattern. I mean, in a fatal police shooting, the second victim is always the truth. And what I mean by that is that when the police put out their version of the story, it usually turns out to be not right. And then another kind of untruth comes through when they begin to trash the reputation of the victim and set the stage for an acquittal. In the run-up to this homicide, from 1973 until this indictment, there has not been a City of Dallas police officer indicted for murder in a fatal police shooting. We had a period about 4 decades where there were no indictments at all in fatal police shootings in the City of Dallas. And then starting in 2017, we began to get some indictments. But let me tell you a little more about the Botham case. He's sitting at home watching football and hanging out, and the officer who lived in the same apartment complex in an apartment below him claimed that she got off duty and was fumbling around in the dark and went to the wrong floor of her building and went to the wrong apartment, which turned out to be his apartment. But she didn't realize she was in the wrong apartment until she shot him to death and claimed that he was a burglar in her apartment. And so that's a classic example of the truth being the second victim in a fatal police shooting. The story preposterous from the start, and obviously the grand jury did not believe that story. Shortly after the day after the shooting, the Dallas police chief announced that they would run a transparent investigation and that she had brought in the Texas Rangers to investigate the shooting. And that was the end of transparency at that point. For instance, the police department leaked out that there was some marijuana and some Adderall in Botham's apartment. And, of course, all the millennials were shocked by that, I'll bet. But that was supposed to trash his character a little bit. And but as far as transparency goes, that was it. Leaks to hurt the defendant. Not the defendant, but the victim. We never heard and still have not heard the shots fired call-in that she did to 911 after she killed Botham. Even though they drug tested Botham, as they always do, the shooting victim of a police officer, they drug tested, and we know the results of that test. The drug test that they did on Amber Guyger has not been released. And, of course, it goes to her state of mind at the time. But that's another clue to there being no transparency there. And so pretty much everything that the police department said after the shooting was made up, was not borne out by any facts that they later released anyway. So Guyger was fired from the department. They charged her with manslaughter, arrested her. She turned herself in with the help of the Dallas Police Association in Kaufman County and they posted her bond, and they've paying for her defense now. After she was indicted, she was booked into the Dallas County Jail, or the Dallas County Jail system anyway. I think she went to Mesquite, and she bonded out in a couple of hours. And so she's out of jail awaiting her trial, which could be as far as a year or two away. So you have a situation. This is one of the very rare indictments of a police officer who kills someone. There's about 1,000 people a year killed by the police in America, and of those, about 200, or about one out of, about 20%, 1 out of 5 is unarmed, as Botham was unarmed. Another 25% of that 1,000 are people with a documented history of mental illness. And anyway, of the 1,000 or so police killings a year, generally there's less than 5 indictments, and usually there's only 1, maybe 2 convictions. So indictment of a police officer in a fatal police shooting is, it's about as rare as a unicorn running down Main Street in your city. And so this is one of those times. Why did it happen? And why did it happen in Dallas, a city that hadn't indicted any officers in over 40 years? And there's 2 explanations for it that I believe, and I've been involved in this issue and in many others in Dallas for 40-something years now, and I've seen the pattern. I mean, even under the old school Southern Democratic District Attorney Henry Wade, the guy who was in place when John F. Kennedy was killed here, there were no indictments of officers who killed people. Under the most liberal Democrat we ever had, which was Craig Watkins. Some of you may know about him because he was very good on exonerations. People who've been wrongly convicted. He worked with the Sentencing Project and got a lot of people that have been wrongly convicted in Dallas County out of jail. But even under him, there were no indictments of police officers. And then we had our conservative Republican Susan Hawk was elected after in 2014, but she had a lot of medical problems, psychiatric problems, and so the department kind of just floundered around. But between the 2 of them, they set up a unit within the DA's office that would look at and do an independent investigations on police shootings. And it was called the Public Integrity Unit, and it had a civil rights component within it. And so, whereas from 1973, which was our last conviction, until 2017, 2016, there were no independent investigations by the DA of a police shooting. Basically, what would happen is that Internal Affairs would investigate any rules violations in a police shooting, and the regular criminal division that investigates all murders would investigate the criminal liability of the officer. They'd send a folder over to the district attorney's office, and they'd basically just fact-check the folder or just review it and then send it up to the grand jury, and there'd be a no bill. And in spite of literally hundreds of police shootings in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there were just no indictments. We had a little boy, many teenagers were killed. We've had elderly people shot. We've had mentally ill people shot. And no indictments, many unarmed. Okay, so after this, the Civil Rights Unit gets set up because it was a kind of a 2-step process. Mothers Against Police Brutality had started protesting Craig Watkins very hard. He had a lot of other problems, like driving while intoxicated, convictions, and so forth, but or at least cases, against him. And but we were hitting him hard on the fact that he was not, in spite of his good work on exonerations, he was doing nothing on police brutality or police shootings. And so one day when Colette Flanagan was picketing his house, one of his assistants came out and said, you know, what y'all ought to be doing is trying to get a unit within the DA's office, you know. That should be your demand. And we thought about it, and Colette thought about it and said, okay, good. And so we began to demand that. And in the election where he was sort of floundering because of the personal problems that I mentioned, he lifted up this unit. He said, I'm going to form a unit to investigate police shootings, although it didn't save his campaign. So then Susan Hawk staffed the unit, but it didn't really go anywhere because during her tenure there was a lot of drift in the department, in the DA's office generally, due to her medical problems. Okay, so when she resigns because of health reasons, Greg Abbott, who is a flat earth conservative, as you well know, appointed Faith Johnson, an African-American woman, and she's kind of like what in some communities you might call a sanctified woman, a Christian woman. And she was immediately endorsed by the Dallas Police Association. Everybody thought she'd just be a straight-up law and order conservative, and we certainly didn't have any hope for her. But we met with her a few times, and we met with her and the Public Integrity Unit, and I'm sure, and many others did too, I'm sure, and pressed them on this lifetime, literally, of 2 generations with no indictments or convictions in police shootings, despite hundreds of shootings. And they said they would take a look at some of the cases we wanted them to re-review and so forth. But anyway, they began to, they indicted an officer in the shooting death of a young woman named Genevieve Dawes. She was shot in January of 2017. And she was indicted in June of 2017. And during that period, the officer who killed her was taken off duty, but he was not fired or charged with anything. And so they had sent over, the Dallas Police Department had sent over a clean file. They weren't recommending any charges, you know. And the district attorney and the grand jury came back with an aggravated assault charge. And we knew that this officer had fired a rifle into Genevieve Dawes' car, but we didn't really know how many times he'd shot her. But it turned out after the videotape was released just this year that he shot 13 times into a car that had stalled. It wasn't like just a parked car, but it had been trying to back up, but it was stalled. And there was a very clear videotape of the whole shooting. And so the police department had that videotape the whole time, but they took no action against the officer. But the new unit within the DA's office said, hey, this isn't a good shooting. This is a bad shooting. And so he was indicted for aggravated assault. The next thing that came up was in May of that year, Bald Springs police officer shot a kid named Jordan Edwards, who was in a carload of teenagers who were trying to leave a party and were driving away from the officer, who also took a high-powered rifle and shot through the window and killed this kid, Jordan Edwards. And Jordan Edwards was kind of like Botham Jean, just like a virtuous young man. Everybody loved him. He was a high school football star. He was an ace academic star. And so it really captured the public's imagination in a way that when you shoot someone who's considered less virtuous, you know, like a homeless man acting weird on the corner, you don't get as much of a good response. Although it shouldn't make any difference, but it does to the public and the media when they cover it. So they got an indictment for murder on the officer that killed him. And then they had the trial later that year and got a conviction. And so, I mean, it was about a year later they had the trial, but got a conviction for murder of Roy Oliver for killing Jordan Edwards. And so I'm starting to think, wow, we're really getting some results here. Is this going to be a new era of accountability in policing in Dallas, or is this just an aberration? You know, we didn't know. But then another case popped up. There'd been a kid named, a young man, a white guy named Tony Timpa, who was acting weird in a parking lot. 3 officers, he called for help. He was paranoid and he got scared, and he called for help, and 3 officers wrestled him down and held him in a restraint hold, and he died. So the officers went off duty for a little while, and this was in 2015, I think. They went off duty for a little while, and then they went back on patrol. The department cleared them, no big deal here. But even though it lacked videotape, it was kind of like an Eric Garner killing. He couldn't breathe, and then he died. And so it was about 2 years later, the new district attorney, she wasn't even the district attorney then. She comes in, and the unit reviews that case, and they charged those 3 officers with a lesser charge, but it was actions causing a death. And the day they were indicted, they were back on duty. And so I bring that up, and I bring up the fact that Christopher Hess, the officer that shot Genevieve Dawes, was on duty, not on duty, but still employed by DPD when he was indicted, to say that in Dallas, the reform has all been, the last couple of years, in the DA's office. Even though our last 2 police chiefs have been considered reformers, David Brown and our current police chief, Renee Hall, are considered reformers. But the department has acted basically the same with all the recent shootings, all the ones I just discussed. And it's the DA's office that has changed it. So we had this structural change in the DA's office. And then we also had have a pretty good movement against police brutality now. And it's like in a lot of cities where you've got your nationwide Black Lives Matter movement, and then you've got locally there's something on the ground that's similar or has similar goals, like Mothers Against Police Brutality or some of the other groups here, the clergy groups. So the movement on the ground, especially the young people that get out there marching for their lives, and that's what captured the public in a way. Why were they out there? Why don't they go home? Why are they stopping traffic? And even, John Q. Citizen, who's really thinking about something else, than police brutality, began to notice, And so the public, through the various groups and through the people that they reached, by protest, began to demand more when the police shoot someone. Instead of the first question be, well, what did the victim do wrong, which is still, in many quarters, the first question. It was like, why did he shoot an unarmed person, And so the protest movement, plus this one structural change, is what led to these recent indictments in Dallas. And the reason I'm stressing the structural change in the DA's office is because it happened at a political moment where you wouldn't expect it. Here you have an appointed DA, Republican, from the right wing of the Republican Party, backed immediately by the Dallas Police Association. And yet it's under her watch that we begin to get these indictments. And it's not because the killings were particularly egregious, although they are, but there'd been many sympathetic killings. I mean, killings of people the public sympathized with down through the years that didn't produce any indictments, But I think that she had the space to maneuver because of the automatic endorsement by the right wing of the Republican Party, who thought she was going to be like Mrs. Law and Order. And so here she is with no opposition on the right, with the movement in the streets and the public opinion, like liberal to left, saying, hey, accountability, we need more accountability. And then I mentioned she was a church-going woman. She's like a member of T.D. Jakes' church, which is a huge evangelical church here, but not a particularly political church. But anyway, I think part of that ethos, that I'm going to do the Lord's work, made her take these cases and look at them as murders, instead of looking for a way to exonerate the officer. So this constellation of forces, and for your older listeners, it's like Nixon in China. When President Nixon recognized People's Republic of China, nobody from the right wing could really attack him because he was the most vicious anti-communist of the post-war era. And so he was able to make that outreach. And so this was kind of a Nixon in China moment for the DA's office because the right wing had already endorsed her completely and unconditionally because of who had appointed her, So we had a very interesting set of forces there that has led to, now we right now have 5 officers under indictment, City of Dallas officers, for either shooting to death, one for murder in a shooting death, one for aggravated assault in a shooting death, and 3 for action causing the death in a physical restraint death that was like similar to, say, the Eric Garner death. And that's really unprecedented here. I mean, the last person, I can't stress it enough, to be indicted here was the guy who killed Santos Rodriguez in 1973. He was also the last person to be convicted, the last officer in the city of Dallas to be convicted of any crime for causing the death of a resident here. So we've got an era there where it was kind of like a dead zone for police accountability, and that dead zone has begun to accountability has begun to be lifted up by, like I say, the movement in the streets combined with this structural change in the DA's office. And so whether we've got a new paradigm here of accountability or whether we just lucked out, after 40 years of unaccountable police homicide, remains to be seen. But that's the current situation in Dallas.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that still remains to be seen as to, what sort of structural changes we might actually be looking at. But I think you hit on so much there that I think is so important. For instance, as we mentioned, the role of these independent organizations and the fact that, often the kind of what we see as quote unquote partisanship, the role of this or that political party is actually pretty negligible. And in fact, if anything, from what I've seen, a Democratic or otherwise kind of liberal, sort of entity within a city can often provide a sort of cover for these kind of police brutality, this police brutality injustice that the kind of the right wing, the Republicans cannot. So I think it's very interesting. And I would also kind of draw some parallels there to, for instance, the fact the resurgence in many ways of the kind of teachers unions actions in the strikes in West Virginia. There were, some strikes and other kind of walkouts and work stoppages in Oklahoma and all these so-called red states, where we were actually seeing kind of the most resurgence in kind of this solidarity. And I wonder if we're not also going to see that again with the South in terms of police brutality. It kind of remains to be seen, but we'll see. We'll see where that goes.
I think that's a good point about the teachers rising up in those states, in those particular states, because what you've got there is you've got the worst conditions and pay for teachers are in the South and in the red states. And then you've got so the issue's much more stark. They don't have any kind of liberal buffer between them and the State Board of Education. One thing I guess that I should point out is that even though we're starting to get some indictments and convictions here, and in other places, the movement is having that effect. But the fact remains that a policeman can really do anything to you in America, even kill you. And 995 times out of 1,000, nothing is going to happen to them. So in any other context, people would see that as a national crisis that requires a national response. Like when the SCLC and SNCC and all are doing the voting rights work in the South in the 60s, even though the place where the oppression was a county registrar's office, it was a grave national crisis of a violation of human rights, right? So nobody suggested to Martin Luther King that, hey, what you really need to do is elect progressive DAs, elect liberals all over the 3,000 counties of America, and then you all will be able to vote. No, they understood it as a national crisis that required a national response. And I think that the more we see it that way, the more likely we are to make some substantial headway, not just a few isolated cases that we do get an indictment in and some justice,
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that seems to be the kind of correct, way forward. Is to really be thinking about these things, not in terms of kind of the electoral politics, but in terms of, what is the relative balance of power, in the streets, on the grounds with community organizations, who can kind of put the long-term pressure on cities and, on a nationwide level, to force these sort of changes. So it looks like we just have a few minutes here, before we have to wrap up. I think this has been a very insightful conversation. I'd love to continue this, continue kind of discussing these things at some later point. So in the last few minutes, maybe can you talk about what you think, not asking for like sort of crystal ball predictions, but what you think the kind of likely outcomes might be of the indictment of Amber Guyger, if that, how that'll affect kind of your work. And then if you can talk about where people who might be interested in Mothers Against Police Brutality can learn, more, and can get involved.
Okay, well, first you can find Mothers Against Police Brutality. We have a website, which is just mothersagainstpolicebrutality.org, or you can just Google it, and it'll come up. And then we have a Facebook page. It's Mothers Against Police Brutality Inc., I guess, is what it is, even though you'll get it either way, We have a group, a Facebook group that's limited to families who've lost loved ones to official police violence, but we have that extra level involvement if that's happened to you or your family. The indictment and hopefully the conviction of Amber Guyger, I think, will strengthen what we're trying to do in Dallas and what other activists and organizations are trying to do here. Sometimes people are motivated to fight back when things are worst, and I think that, like, the origin of the whole Black Lives Matter movement was like, wow, a vigilante can just take some kid's life, Trayvon Martin, and nothing happens to him. You can't get much lower than that as far as how the nation sees the value of your life. And so Black Lives Matter was like, a cry of the heart against that. But it's also true that when people get some victories, then they want to get more, And a victory might sound like the wrong word. I mean, we know that an indictment and even a conviction doesn't bring back Botham Jean to his family or to his church or to the community or to St. Lucia. But it is a victory to get some justice against police officers who abuse their power, and some to try to get some democratic control over the police. I guess the reason I'm talking about the national solution is I think that ultimately the human rights of people in this country are guaranteed at the national level. We don't go to the federal government because we love centralized bureaucracy. We go there because the Constitution is from the federal government, and we should have the same rights if we live in Dallas, Texas, or Selma, Alabama, or Manhattan, and we should be treated the same. So if you think that, then you can understand why it would be important to have national standards for when deadly forces can be used. And so the different police departments have different kind of training, And so if we had, and most of them are like pro-police groups that do the training. So if we had a national standard and had national training standards, then if you're facing a cop in Orlando, Florida, or Portland, Oregon, you're going to be facing the same standard and the same criteria for whether that police officer is going to kill you or not. I guess I'd like to say that sometimes as a movement matures a little bit, some of the impetus goes out of street protest, and you'll hear people say, no, we did all that before. We're just going to do lobbying now. And usually that's when the movement begins to die, because lobbying is a function of money and protest is a function of people. And so most groups that want to change things do not have a lot of money, It's important, like you said, to stay in the streets when necessary and to not shy away from it. And you can see this in countries all around the world. I mean, the sort of nonviolent civil rights style protest that King picked up from Gandhi in India and brought back here. I mean, this is a worldwide thing. People go into the streets all over the world to assert their rights and make their claim, to whatever, freedom and justice for all. And it's a method that works. It works particularly well in a Western democracy. And it's the one method that they don't really know how to stop. In other words, if you want to pick up a gun and go shoot the man, so to speak, they got a bigger gun. I mean, they'll drop a nuclear bomb on you if they have to. But they don't know what to do with a relentless, nonviolent, direct action.
So I think we're going to have to leave it there. We've been talking with John Fullinwider. He's a co-founder of Mothers Against Police Brutality, as well as a longtime community organizer. Thank you very much, John, for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. Keep up the great work.
That's all we have for this week. You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. Thank you for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.